Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Budget 2024 webinar. We are really excited to dive into some of the announcements that were made last week in Alberta's budget. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So last week, as the basis of our program here at Pocket Lobbyist is providing people with access to political risk, which is also business risk. So we have a newsletter, we have a membership, as well as cohorts. So we are really excited to offer you folks a discount at the end of this session. So stick around to make sure that you have the opportunity to claim that. And if you signed up to this webinar, you will also already be signed up to our newsletter. So you'll be getting all of the updates relevant there as well. Today, we're going to do a brief overview of what's included in Budget 2024. If you are a member, you'll have access to our dashboard, our briefing note, and several more resources available on the platform. So we're going to just take a look at the high-level numbers as well as some context and nuance. We'll break some of the key ministries down for you, and then we will talk about what it means and share the discounts. So if you want access to our membership products, you'll have that following if you sign up and use our code that we'll give you at the end here. So Budget 2024 was tabled last Thursday in Alberta on February 29th. It was tabled by Alberta's Finance Minister, Nate Horner, and obviously had a lot of oversight by Premier's Office and Treasury Board. The name of this year's budget is called A Responsible Plan for a Growing Province. Now, we'll get into talking about some of the particulars and details included as part of this budget, but you'll notice that population growth is a significant source of the growth in revenue in Alberta, as well as something to consider for future fiscal plans in terms of funding healthcare, education, and all of the different services that the Alberta government funds and that Albertans need. The fiscal plan this year, as part of its larger narrative, a responsible plan for a growing province, had two key priorities. So the first priority is boosting Alberta's advantage, which has a lot to do with tax advantages and investing in growing industries that Alberta has typically been competitive at, as well as investing in both healthcare and education. Now, you'll notice that even though this was definitely not a huge spending increase budget, both healthcare and education were increased significantly. And you can tell that this is two areas that the government is really focused on making sure are funded, especially with respect to the growing pressures on population growth. Now, many of you might be familiar, last year in Budget 2023, Alberta introduced what's called a new fiscal framework. Now, this is not the first time that the Alberta government decided to put fiscal guardrails, if you'll remember, from 2019 in place. So this is an effort that has started really in 2019 under the former Kenney government, former Finance Minister Travis Taves. This is an effort to bring Alberta off the resource revenue roller coaster. Now, if you're from Alberta or you pay close attention to Alberta politics, you'll know that this is no surprise. This conversation has been going on for years in Alberta, and different governments apply different approaches in terms of how they're going to address this. Now, this government has decided to bring in legislated fiscal framework, which includes three sort of key tenets. The first is a requirement for balanced budgets. Now, once we get into talking about the particulars of today's presentation, you'll notice that there's a $367 million accounting surplus in this year's budget. It also limits year-over-year operating increases to no more than population growth or inflation. Now, you'll notice that the increases in operational spending were about 3.9% increases, so not quite to the same rate as population growth and spending, but there are still definitely increases there to be noted. And as well, any sort of in-year increases have to be used on a pre-voted contingency fund. So when we go into the allocation of surplus cash as well, there is a very specific methodology in how Alberta pays for surpluses. So when we talk about where this money goes, half is going towards repaying debt and the other half into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. So there's a $367 million surplus, and that's where they have decided to allocate some from last year as well as this year. So now when we dive into looking at the numbers, we see our high level numbers here. So revenue is about 75.6 billion, and that was from last year. You see it's lower this year at 73.5 billion. You see operating expense has also increased from 57.9 billion. And then you also see capital grants have increased as well since 2023-24. Contingency fund is lower. So that's the cushion that the government is using to offset any sort of expenditures that they need. Oftentimes this is used for emergency preparedness or disaster relief. And then you also see that surplus that was projected at $5.2 billion lower now at $367 million. Now, it's important to note as well that this is an accounting surplus. So Alberta is going to still have to borrow for its operations, according to this budget, about $2.4 billion. But the way that surplus and deficit is calculated in accounting terms is revenues and expenditures. And so in that calculation, Alberta is left with a $367 million surplus. As well, when we consider debt, we see that debt from last year's forecast, so that would have been from last budget's numbers at 76.1 billion, you see that increasing to 78.4 billion this year. So we are still increasing that debt allocation, but that is expected to eventually go down after some of those lump sum payments that Alberta is making continue to be made. Now, when we are looking at energy assumptions, very, very important for us to consider this in Alberta since we are not off the resource revenue roller coaster at this point. WTI is projected to be down a bit to 74 US dollars a barrel. The differential, though, between light heavy is a little bit lower, which is good. You see natural gas is higher as well, and then the exchange rate a bit higher as well. Now, this is important for Alberta to consider because so much of its revenue is from energy. And so that exchange rate and what Alberta is getting on the global markets for its price of oil have a very significant impact on Alberta's budget. Now, when we look at revenue, we see sort of the breakdown of where that revenue is coming from this year. So we see a big chunk coming from tax revenue, non-renewable resource revenue, as well as certain federal transfers and other investment income as well. Now, I wanted to bring this chart up because I think it's really important to look at spending over time. So this shows how Alberta has been spending in both operational and capital costs since 2008 and 2009. And so you can see that steadily increasing over time. So each year, with the exception of perhaps a couple of years, Alberta has increased its spending and its capital spending as well, operational and capital. But of course, we also need to consider this in the context of inflationary and population pressures as well, which this chart does not adjust for. When we look at some of these economic assumptions that are really important, one of the things that we'll talk a lot about in today's presentation is the idea of sort of economic growth and productivity growth. So we see that Alberta's debt to GDP ratio is down, which is good. In many sort of government and public realms, the sort of net debt to GDP ratio is considered, if it's over 30%, it's considered a bit much by some folks. This is debt to GDP. So this is taxpayer debt to GDP. So Alberta is doing relatively well at 9.1%. You also see that real GDP growth is up, which is important because this has to do with productivity, and this has to do with how well Alberta is doing in an inflation-adjusted environment when we're looking at GDP growth. Population growth is going to decrease from last year. We had huge interprovincial and international influxes last year, 4.1% increases from last year's forecast. This year, it will still be quite high, the highest in Canada, and we'll talk a bit about that, but a bit lower at 3.7%. The unemployment rate is going to go up. So last year projected at 5.9%, this year projected at 6.5%. A lot of the sort of reasoning for this does have to do with Alberta's large population growth increases as well. And so that is why real GDP growth, productivity, job creation is important, because when we have a growing economy, we need to make sure that we have jobs, a growing population, we need to make sure that there are jobs for people when they come here. And when you're looking at CPI, so CPI is a measure of inflation, consumer price index. So this is for Alberta. So last year was at 3.3%. This year it is projected to be at 2.5%. So lower than last year, which is promising for inflationary reasons, for sure. Now, when we look at where some of the surplus went in this year's budget, we see the Heritage Savings Trust Fund is going to increase to about $23.8 billion this year. That was from a $2 billion deposit in 23-24. The Heritage Savings Trust Fund, for those who don't know, was established in 1976. It had a vision for creating a sovereign wealth fund for Alberta that's much like some of the sovereign wealth funds you see in Nordic countries. The new fiscal framework that was introduced last year by Alberta requires that 100% of the net income, so the investment income that is raised on the trust fund, to be reinvested into that trust fund. And so that goal that the province has at this point, and a big reason why those big deposits are made, and there's plans for even more deposits into the future, is that Alberta does want to grow the fund to 250 to 400 billion by 2050. Now that's a long way to go from 23.8 billion. So in addition to reinvesting that investment income, it is going to require that Alberta increases deposits into this fund more than just investment income. So you can expect to see in future years, there will be big chunks of money going into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund if they continue on this track. Now, the reason why the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and debt are big priorities for this government is that they see building up the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and making investments into paying off Alberta's debt, taxpayer-supported debt, is going to be a way in which Alberta can get off that resource revenue roller coaster. Now, you can see historically since 2008, 2009, the way in which the taxpayer-supported debt in Alberta has increased, and so too have those debt servicing costs increased. So this year, I think that debt servicing costs are between $3 and $4 billion. That is more than most of the ministerial budgets in all of Alberta, individually speaking. So it is a significant amount of money that is being invested in toward debt repayment. And if we expect that interest rates are not going to decline as fast as we would hope, both at a personal and government level, it's safe to say that we would anticipate that these increases will continue to go up, which will continue to increase the cost of carrying this debt, which is why Alberta does want to get it down. Another measure of looking at debt and the relative, ability of a province to carry debt, a lot of times we watch American news and we see the idea of debt as being not necessarily that bad for jurisdictions. The US is a bit different than Canada even, and Alberta especially, in that it's a reserve currency. So having debt in the United States, for example, is not the same as a jurisdiction like Alberta having debt. Now, I think this is a really interesting chart. It's from the Fraser Institute, and it's linked at the bottom. It talks about the growing debt burden for Canadians. So now if you look across jurisdictions, Alberta definitely has the lowest provincial net debt as a percentage of GDP. It's definitely got the lowest overall debt of all Canadian provinces, which this government, I think, would argue is part of the Alberta advantage. But you look sort of across Canada, including the federal government, you see that, since 2007, 2008, our net debt provincially and federally has increased to about $2.2 trillion. And so debt across the country is likely going to be a growing concern. Debt and public spending have impacts definitely on the interest rate as well. So, as we sort of enter this post-COVID era, I think you will start to see a lot of jurisdictions turn to addressing their debt and sort of creating more sustainable ways in which to manage that, as we are probably not going to see the same kind of low interest rate environment that we've seen, over the past several years. And so it's going to cost these jurisdictions more money, which takes away from program spending. Speaking of population growth and the need for Alberta to continue to sort of reinforce investments into program spending, we saw 184,000 newcomers from other provinces and internationally, an increase of 4.1% come in 2023-24. We are looking at projections included in budget, and it is anticipated that we will be a province of 5 million by 2026. So Alberta is definitely a high growth province. We're seeing the majority of that growth come from international, but as well interprovincial, and then those sort of natural increases, people being born and passing away as well. This is a really interesting chart to consider too, because when we look at, okay, where is the population growth coming from in Alberta, we see the vast majority of that interprovincial growth coming from both Ontario and British Columbia. And when we look at the vast majority of growth between interprovincial, natural increases and international, we definitely see a huge flux in international. Alberta has been supporting a lot of Ukrainian newcomers and other newcomers, and that is a big chunk of the newcomers that are coming to the province. And so we see huge increases there that will have to be accounted for in public spending, education, healthcare, all of those kinds of things. Now, when we look at some of the context and nuance on what do the numbers say and what do they not say, their budgets are always telling a story. So there's the story that is included explicitly in the budget, and then there's the sort of undercurrents of the budget that are included as well. So this section is going to provide a bit of context and nuance on what we see versus what we don't see. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the promises that were made in the election campaign and how those unfolded. So you saw in the provincial election that there was a commitment to community recreation center infrastructure program. So this is a fund that would support communities with recreation centers, hockey rinks, etc. That is included in this budget. There's $30 million for that over 3 years. We also saw the UCP commit to a seniors discount, so 25% discount for registry services and driving tests. That is included in this budget at a cost of $16.6 million per year estimated. We'll see what that shakes out to next year once we have those numbers. And then we also saw previously Alberta commit to the industrial heartland industrial zone. And that's the first one in the province. They've committed another $32 million. They've committed to $32 million over 3 years for that. And so we see that continue as a promise as well. Now, when we're looking at sort of new and notable spending increases here, we see that we have as promised, the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program, 12% for eligible capital projects. That's included. That was announced last fall, and we see it here as well in budget. We also see a new local growth and sustainability grant. So this is an application-based program for municipalities. As we'll talk about a bit later, we noticed that the municipal capital funding stream of MSI is now switching over to local government fiscal framework, LGFF. So this is an additional source of granting funding that municipalities can access on top of LGFF. We also see a new electric vehicle tax. So this is an annual $200 tax on electric vehicles that's paid during the registration process, which could start as early as next January. It needs to be introduced during legislation in the fall. And so that's estimated to bring in about $1 million in revenue over 24-25. You also see some funding for flood adaptation as well as contingency. So $10 million for flood adaptation, and then contingency funding of $2 billion that will go to support any sort of disaster services. We're looking at a concerning wildfire season. The province has already been addressing that. So we see that and we see funding for it as well. When we look at what is not there, which is sometimes harder to pick up, we have a full commitment tracker on the Pocket Lobbyist platform, which tracks all of these commitments. So it's really easy for us to actually go into that spreadsheet and look at, what was promised and what's not there. Some of these things have also been talked about in the news as well. But there's sort of two major things that are noticeably absent from this budget. So during the campaign, the UCP promised to introduce a new tax bracket for under $60,000 at 8%. Now, that is not happening this budget. And next budget, it will only be 9% with a full implementation in 26-27. So that is definitely something that's noticeably missing from this budget that there's been a lot of discussion in the media about. The reason the government decided not to do that this year was because of debt repayment and getting off that oil resource revenue roller coaster. And they wanted to be responsible with how they were allocating those cuts. So that would have cost $1.4 billion. It's not happening this year. The next thing is the South Edmonton Hospital, which is a project that was first announced by the Alberta NDP in 2017. The UCP had previously committed funding for it, but it is not in this year's capital plan. There's been a lot of talk about that as well. One reason why it might not be in this capital plan is because of the healthcare refocus that's in place. We don't know why things are or are not included, but definitely I can see the government wanting to figure out what their refocus strategy is going to be. But those beds are definitely needed in Edmonton. And so I know that that is a very big area of concern for folks that are in that region. Now, if we break it down by ministry, before we do that, I just want to provide some context on the ministry by ministry sort of process. So for those that don't know, budget was introduced last Thursday. We are on a constituency break week this week, and then we go into a period of what's called government estimates. And so this is a period where government ministers appear before certain committees of the legislature and talk about what is included in budget. And so if you are particularly interested in the line by line breakdown of several different ministries or just one particular ministry, you should make sure that you're watching and tuning into budget estimates. For Pocket Lobbyist members, we do update our budget briefing note and watch estimates so that all of that information is included. But if you are interested in some of those more details, make sure that you're watching that over the next little bit. As well, I would say watch for the Q1 fiscal update that's always at the end of August. That will show how the government is tracking against the commitments it's made in this budget up until for Q1. So it'll give us a sort of first sense of whether the government is tracking to what it said it was going to spend. And then you also see there's a fall sitting that's going to happen later this year, scheduled for October 28th to December 5th. We see that there's going to be electric vehicle tax legislation introduced there. And then also on November 30th, that mid-year fiscal update, which will give us an even more clear idea of where the government is at in terms of its spending. Now, on our Pocket Lobbyist platform, we have a really awesome spreadsheet that breaks down all of the different operational buckets, increases, decreases. Now, we see that there's about 25 buckets, including legislative assembly offices and contingency funds, as well as executive council and all 24 ministries. Now, there are some nuances in the increases and decreases to be aware of. There are several funding streams and program streams and areas of public policy responsibility that did move around, not just after this budget, but after the election, with some of those responsibilities moving around. So we're showing you the sort of raw numbers of increases and decreases, but to get a really holistic look, it's better to go into the government estimates and look at those individual line items, because there are certain areas that wouldn't be a fair comparison from last year to this year because things did move around. So it's always good to go in and look at those line item increases and those program increases directly, because sometimes the top line numbers can be a little bit deceiving or misleading. I want to first talk about, before we get into some of the specific ministries that I think are important, I want to just talk about the big five. So these are the five ministries that cost the government of Alberta the most, and they take up 78% of Alberta's budget at a cost of about 55.7 billion. So you can see health, education, advanced education, seniors, community, social services, all public services that are taking up the majority of the budget, which I think most people agree with. But just to give you a sense of the immense size of these ministries and the sort of impact that has. So this even gives you a better sense. So 78% of Alberta's budget is spent on 5 departments, and then the rest of the budget, the remaining 22%, is spent on 21 other areas, and that's 15.5 billion. So when you look at if you're a stakeholder in one of the 21 line items, there is limited funding to go around in a lot of these other programs because there's so much funding being allocated to those 5. So it's very interesting to see. You can see as well just the investments that they did make in health, education, and advanced education are significant this fiscal. Speaking of health, we'll get into an overview of some of the key ministries now. So the big takeaway here with health, for those that aren't aware, is the process that Alberta is going through right now on their healthcare refocus, which is a complete reorganization of how healthcare is delivered in the province. You will note that Alberta Health Services is being restructured. It will be a service delivery arm of the acute care organization. There'll be 4 organizations: acute care, primary care, long-term care, as well as a mental health organization that will coordinate and deliver healthcare services to Albertans. This is a big change. This is not a return to regional healthcare as we've seen in the past, pre-2008, but it is a change in service delivery and policy development as well. You'll see a lot more of the policy and strategic direction of the healthcare system refocused back into the minister's office versus AHS as it sort of had been for the past several years. You see as well that education is funded through enrollment growth. So Alberta saw 28,000 new students in 23-24, and they have provided an additional 842 million over 3 years to fund enrollment growth. You see this is a huge issue. They've also invested billions of dollars in new schools as well, which is fantastic. And they are also going through a 7 to 12 curriculum redesign in the next few years. So just like you saw in the K to 6, so too will happen in the 7 to 12. In advanced education, you continue to see strategic capital investments like at the U of C, Olds, and U of L in building skills for jobs. So this strategy is really about connecting the post-secondary education that's delivered within Alberta's system to both the education system, so that K to 12 level, and then further as well into the job market. So when we look at what Alberta needs in the short term or the long term, we look at healthcare workers, we look at tech and innovation, we look at agriculture, we look at medicine, we look at all of these areas, and we see that the province has made investments in those areas in the post-secondary institutions for sure. And we also see that they have capped tuition at 2%, which will probably be a welcome development for folks because there's not a ton with respect to those concentrated affordability supports that we've seen in previous years. When we look as well in seniors, community, and social services, again, the budget spending is down this year, but that is largely because the $198 million in one-time affordability payments that were afforded in last year's budget are not included in this year's budget. So it's not a program decrease, but those affordability spending metrics are not in there this year. So it is an overall decrease in the budget. You do see maintained spending for the bucket that funds civil societies, as well as family, community, and social and support services, FCSS, municipally. So you don't see any changes there. You'll have to sort of dig into the application process on those when they become available, but we did not see any cuts in those areas that we can tell from the estimates. When we look at Treasury Board and Finance, we obviously see that this tax break has been delayed. So we do not see that under 60,000 being introduced this time. We also see both cigarettes and smokeless tobacco taxes increasing, and then the federal government, the provincial government joining the federal provincial vaping framework as well. And then you see an increase in costs for the ministry that have to do somewhat with investment costs as well. When we look at jobs, economy, and trade, a very interesting sort of change and move in this budget is that we see childcare strategy move from what could have been in family and childhood services or in community and social services is now in jobs, economy, and trade, which is really interesting. So you see that budget increase significantly because there's $1.4 billion worth of affordability grants and subsidies for that daycare program. This is a really interesting move of the province. The way that it's described in this budget has a lot to do as an economic enabler. So seeing childcare as an economic investment, which I think is quite interesting. I think it's certainly when you look at equality and participation in the labor force, that is a very big investment that the federal government spearheaded, that Alberta has implemented. So it is a good investment in terms of growing the economy. And then you also see that they have continued to promise that Alberta is calling campaign. So those are the $5,000 attraction bonuses for individuals in select spheres that will be focused on bringing skilled workers to Alberta because of our growing economy. So that will attract, healthcare workers or tech workers. The exact details were sort of touched on during the campaign, but will be highlighted in the near future. So for municipal affairs, some big changes coming here, nothing surprising in budget, as we knew that local government fiscal framework was going to come into place, replacing MSI. But you see there, you've got $724 million in 24-25, and then in 25-26 and 26-27 investments as well. So in addition to LGFF, we also have local growth and the local growth and sustainability grant, which is new, $20 million in 24-25, and then every year after that as well. And then there is no change to the rate of education property tax, but because of Alberta's significant population growth, as well as increases in home values, we actually do expect to see that the education property tax will bring in an extra $200 million from last year without even changing the tax rate as well. So when we look at public safety and emergency services, we see the government, their announcement during the campaign of Safe Streets Action Plan continue to be implemented. And then they are increasing the Alberta Emergency Management Agency by $3 million. Of course, we are watching those wildfires across the province, and that'll be a big focus of the next little while. Environment and protected areas, we see that commitment to the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program. They are going to take $226 million from last year's budget, combine it with $167 million for this year's budget for new investments in that program, which will work very similarly to APIP, so the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, where companies will receive that granting program once their project is operational. And then you see as well that tier fund continue to be funded through the industrial carbon tax, which is through the tier fund, which is what companies pay on their industrial emissions, which is then reinvested into clean technologies and innovations that can help reduce emissions. So as well, Rebecca Schultz will be working really closely on the wildfire and public safety file as we see sort of droughts and dry weather affect Alberta over the next several weeks and months. As well, mental health and addiction seeing a huge bump here in $27 million in expanded programming costs. This will continue to be a really important ministry that it has been significantly elevated and is a big part of the healthcare refocus as well. For arts, culture, and status of women, we do see an increase in funding for the Alberta Foundation for the Arts. So you see that over the next several years. And then you do see some select cultural projects being funded in the province. But again, not a ton to go around in this ministry. For Indigenous relations, Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation will increase with an additional $1 billion in funding available for investment. So originally it started off with $1 billion, it was increased to $2 billion. By the end of 24-25, they will have had $3 billion in investment funds. This creates opportunities for Indigenous communities to have access to capacity or investment funding for projects that they want to be an equal partner with certain organizations. Now, when we look at what do all of these numbers and facts and figures mean, one of the things that I think, which may not be a welcome development for many, but is a reality, is that we are entering a period of a new normal. Now, I very much see in this budget a willingness of this government and a desire from this government to make paying off or significantly decreasing Alberta's debt a legacy and sort of landmark accomplishment for this government. So you will not continue to see, with fluctuations in revenue, huge fluctuations in operating spending. So Alberta definitely is going to enter an environment, especially for nonprofits and people who may have typically been used to seeing certain funding automatically come their way. We are definitely going to see that the government is going to want to have really strong business cases for the funding that they are distributing. Healthcare and education were quite high, but definitely in community and social services and arts, et cetera, there's a desire, it seems, to make sure that funding is very much results-based and investments are made in a sort of measured way. So that is something to include and think about in your budgets. And, as far as budgets go, it's not yours until it's in your bank account. And so just in terms of your own internal planning on that, that's something to sort of take a look at. So as well, we saw that in the fiscal framework, Alberta was limiting its increases to population growth and inflation. Some people may have read that last year as pegging. So, if Alberta would have increased spending across its operations commensurate with population growth and inflation, we'd be looking at 6% increases, when really we only have about 3.9% increases. So don't expect that spending increases are going to account for both population growth and inflation. It gives them the leeway to increase that much if they want to, but if they do continue to want to address the debt, it's not going to be something that they'll do to the max every time. And as much as we're barely through this budget, one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that if you did not get what you wanted in this budget, the time to start thinking about and planning for next budget is right now. And so right now, I would be working with your teams, with your boards, with your stakeholders to sort of understand what some of the projections are over the next few years and developing your business case for what your asks are going to be next year. And you can start submitting those and working with ministers' offices and departments on those sort of after this budget process has wrapped. But do make sure that you're thinking about getting those in early and ahead of time, and make sure that there is a business case for every ask, even if you yourself are not a business. Framing things in terms of results, of numbers, of investment, getting private sector partners on things. All of these things take time to pull together and will be really important to make your case when there are sort of limited funds to go around. So that concludes our very, quick recap of Budget 2024. If you are interested in more information, please do reach out to us. We also have this special offer that we're happy to provide everybody who's on the webinar. So if you'd like to access our materials online, we are giving 25% off for both annual and monthly memberships if you sign up by tonight. And so you can do so by scanning the code there and entering the promotion code of Budget 24 XPL. So thank you to everybody. You will receive an email with this information, but we really appreciate you being here. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning, and we hope that we will be of service and help for all of your budget needs now and into the future. So thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful week.